I thought I would just start off with giving you a little bit of context in terms of my own involvement with research in clinical hypnosis, and then just sort of talk a little bit about I guess the different aspects that are major considerations in conducting either case studies or I thought I would start off with discussing randomized clinical trials and then just sort of open up for questions, discussion. I think as most of you know, I'm editor of the International Journal of Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis and very interested in submissions from Saybrook. And I can also comment on, if you would like me to, what I see as, I don't know, excellent manuscripts, and then what are some common errors of manuscripts that are submitted to the journal. So just to start off a little bit about my own background, I'm trained as a clinical health psychologist, and after completion of internship, I took a position as assistant professor in a school of medicine, and then working primarily as a clinician at Baylor Scott and White Clinic in Temple, Texas. My work, I was, of course, very interested in clinical hypnosis and its applications. And so my work really focused on clinical hypnosis uh, applications, primarily in medical settings as well as in psychotherapy. Um, I would say during that time, my focus was really on developing clinical skills and from my perspective, really understanding what is hypnosis and how it can be of benefit primarily to patients with a wide range of problems. I think most of us who practice clinical hypnosis, we get interesting referrals and a wide range of referrals for different problems. I went on to serve as chair of the education committee for ASH and teaching workshops and opportunity to teach and study, and then went on to serve as chair of the standards of training in clinical hypnosis and president of ASCH, and I've also served as president of SESH, which Dr. Moss is currently the great president of SESH, as well as APA Division 30. It was really during my clinical work that's seen many patients that I really felt like to make the major contribution to our field that advancing clinical research was important. And so really it was, from my perspective, although I was in a medical school, but primarily teaching and doing some papers and writing, but it was really an intentional career shift for me to turn toward clinical hypnosis research, and really just I would say is almost like learning a new language, uh, making the transition from clinical work to doing clinical research, and in particular randomized clinical trials. And so I was fortunate enough to receive funding from the National Institutes of Health to begin doing some clinical trials. And so that's really been a pathway of great support. Um, I've been funded by NIH for, I guess, now about the past 25 years, and currently just recently finished up a study. I sent a copy of the most recent publication to Dr. Wilmarth, but I'm guessing that you didn't get it, the email issues. But The most recent study, and I can talk about if you would like me to, but was a multi-site randomized clinical trial that was published in JAMA, Journal of the American Medical Association. And so that study is just recently completed, in which uh, the intervention was a self-administered hypnosis intervention for hot flashes and improving sleep in postmenopausal women and breast cancer survivors. One of the unique aspects to that study was the development of a sham hypnosis control group. And in conducting randomized clinical trials of hypnosis, like the control group is as important as the intervention group, because you're really trying to tease out, what degree is the effect that we see due to common factors or placebo factors and so on. And this is really a challenge in hypnosis research or really any mind-body research, because even if you look at studies, which are lots of studies on mindfulness and mindfulness-based interventions or other mind-body interventions, but when people complete an informed consent and they either get the super interesting mindfulness intervention or they're randomized to wait list, usual care, or sometimes health education. And of course, people know which arm they got randomized to. It's usually pretty transparent. And so we really tried to take this on in terms of creating a sham condition that would look exactly like, so people couldn't tell the difference, that they wouldn't know if they were randomized to the real hypnosis or if they were randomized to a sham condition. And from my perspective, like, this is a big innovation, because I don't know of one study that's ever been done in which people got sham mindfulness intervention. I know it's been done in biofeedback, but if you look at some of these more popular current mindfulness or hypnosis or other mind-body interventions, um, although they all show positive benefits for most things, but the control group is an important aspect. Um, so I'm going to just sort of talk about the different steps in designing randomized clinical trials. Why don't I pause and see if there are any comments or questions before I sort of go on to that.
It just, some of the sham biofeedback ones, were things like switching the degrees, but it probably took 2 nanoseconds for a patient to realize that when they tense, it goes down, and when they relax, it goes up. So, some of those were pretty transparent too. So I think it's the whole mind body. It's very difficult to not know, and obviously it's not double blind because the therapist is hopefully knows the difference. So.
That's right. It, it's almost impossible. I mean, you can do a double blind. Like I saw one study where individuals got, audio recorded sessions, and so they had on headphones. So, like, the experimenter, like, they couldn't tell what they were necessarily listening to, um, and it did support hypnosis for sleep improvement. Um, but yeah, it's challenging. I think that it brings up one of the things that, like, as a researcher is different than doing clinical work, in that, you have to be objective. Like, you have to not care. Like, if the placebo condition comes out great, then the cards have to fall wherever they may. So, being willing to be objective or be blinded. For example, in this most recent study that I mentioned that was published in JAMA, we set up the study so that as the principal investigator, did not have access to the data until the study was closed. So, like, no peeking at the data. Is it going good? We had to wait till the end to sort of open it up and see, well, how did it actually come out? And really, I wasn't the interventionist personally for any of the intervention, so we really were blinded and didn't know, like what was going to be the findings.
Well, and partial blinding at least is helpful if the people doing the scoring and the analyzing don't know which group they're scoring. That helps.
It does.
Although the person actually doing the intervention has to know. But that person should not be then scoring and analyzing.
I agree. Well, let me just sort of go on and talk a little bit about randomized clinical trial studies as it relates to hypnosis. So, as editor of the journal, we published all kinds of different articles, ranging from theoretical articles, single case studies. Um, uh, it could be pilot studies, feasibility studies, crossover randomized clinical trials, all the range of different study designs and different levels of research. And so one of the common errors that I see that sometimes happens is where an individual is interested in maybe an application of a hypnosis intervention for a particular problem. And so um, the a study is designed, and so one arm individuals are randomized to receive a hypnosis intervention. And then, of course, like we have been discussing, the other group is randomized to a control intervention, and then the study is conducted. Well, it's good. I mean, it's good to do a randomized trial, no matter what. But if a study just begins in that way, it's missing like the essentials that should occur before going to a randomized clinical trial. So, like what I mean is, if the hypnosis intervention, that could be a lot of different things. And so, if the investigator is just making up the hypnosis intervention, or if it's just based on their impressions from their own clinical work, then first, there's no opportunity to optimize the intervention, to have a good reason to think that it would actually work. They don't know if is this the right number of sessions? Should we screen for hypnotizability? Is this going to work with everybody? Um, it doesn't address underlying essential questions like the rationale for the intervention. Um, why would we think that a hypnosis intervention would be um, like effective or the ideal intervention for this, whatever that problem might be? And so in designing randomized clinical trials, what I would really emphasize is that uh, what should come before the randomized clinical trial, and especially if you're a student and you're thinking doctoral dissertation, or you're a clinician, or you're in an academic setting and you're have a particular focus, a hypnosis research, what needs to come before the randomized clinical trial is first a theoretical paper. So, like what I mean is there should be a review of the literature, and then some theoretical formulation about what is the hypnosis intervention. So you have to define hypnosis, and then like there has to be a conceptual framework. So usually a conceptual framework, it begins with the intervention. And so whatever that intervention might be, and then what are the mechanisms that we suppose the intervention will have an impact on, and then the clinical outcome. In hypnosis studies, we usually assume that the intervention, a moderator, will be hypnotizability. And so, considering measurement of hypnotizability and when will hypnotizability be measured, a lot of times that conceptual framework and the measurement of hypnotizability might come either before or after the intervention. And so, like, what I mean is, like, that theoretical framework is important to do first, and then that really should be followed by a feasibility study. And so, a feasibility study, the purpose of a feasibility study is to determine the feasibility of accrual, um, the feasibility of the intervention. Is it acceptable? Is it likely that people will actually do it? Can you achieve adherence? And then, how will it be measured? Like, are the measurement scales, are they actually good scales that for certain can measure the outcome accurately? And then if there is a conceptual framework, some consideration of the measurement of the uh, underlying mechanism, if that's possible. And so usually if it's possible, that feasibility study should include both um, objective outcomes as well as subjective ratings. So, like, what I mean is that pilot study, it shouldn't be to determine efficacy. So, like, generally in small pilot studies, even if you find that there is benefit, well, it may be that there's bias in the study. Like, people know if they were randomized to which arm. The researchers are typically biased. Like, they want the intervention to come out and have a good effect. And so that can be conveyed. And so even if you find, well, hey, it worked, well, it's good to report that, but it shouldn't be taken as like, okay, we already proved it's effective, because the pilot study is just to do the preliminary work. Sometimes before going to the randomized clinical trial, it's often recommended that there be an optimization study. And so you do a feasibility study, you show it's feasible, you show that you can measure the outcome, that the intervention potentially has a beneficial effect. And then in the optimization study, you're trying to determine, like, is the intervention as designed, is it the optimal number of sessions? Is, the content of hypnotherapy, it can vary wildly. Like, an example, and as Dr. Moss mentioned, like this morning we started off and we had a hypnosis research group meeting, and we were talking about potential adverse events and that can occur in hypnosis research. And of course, I mean, like, should the intervention include age regression, or is that really beneficial? Is that an important component of the intervention? Um, should it include, relaxation suggestions, or is that a distraction? Um, the content of hypnotic suggestions is usually driven mainly by what do we suppose the underlying mechanism might be by which the hypnosis alters uh, the symptom or the problem of concern. Um, and so, like in that process of optimization, um, a, a treatment manual has to be developed. So without a treatment manual, the study can't be replicated. You don't know if there was really adherence to the intervention. Was it really delivered as intended? And so, like, what I mean is that those preliminary studies should occur before going on to the randomized clinical trial. Otherwise, it's to some extent, it's just sort of, I don't know, throwing darts in the dark and hoping that they hit, um, and then really not being sure exactly like, oh, that's a great result. Well, how'd that happen? And so uh, that preliminary work is important first. Again, let me pause for a minute and see if there's any comments or questions about that, and then I'll go on to talk a little bit about designing clinical trial.
Gary, are there standardized treatment manuals available for students who want to do styles? Because there are obviously hundreds of studies that have been done. Has there any standardized manuals been developed?
Yeah, so that is absolutely super great question. And there really have been. If there is a problem that is of interest, like student goes, I'm interested in this. Well, has there already been a treatment manual developed? And very often there has been. For example, in the IJCH, if an individual submits their manuscript, of course, you can't put the treatment manual in the article, but supplemental material. And so we request that the author either provide the treatment manual in a supplemental material, or that they include a statement and a link that if someone is interested, how can they get it? Um, and usually people are fairly freely willing to share their manual. The only thing that gets in the way of that, or they should be, is if someone is trying to take their treatment manual and turn it into a book that they're going to sell, then they may be less willing to share the treatment manual. But if they've got on the way to publishing their article, the treatment manual is important. Like an example, I sent Dr. Wilmarth ahead of this meeting. Um, One of the areas of focus of research in my lab has been mindful hypnotherapy, and so the idea that underlies mindful hypnotherapy is that mindfulness-based interventions have been shown to have a modest impact on a range of problems, primarily emotional, psychological problems, anxiety, depression, stress, and so on. But it's usually kind of burdensome, kind of time consuming, and it doesn't actually work for everybody. And so the idea underlying mindful hypnotherapy was if we combine a hypnotherapy intervention with mindfulness-based suggestions and goals, that it could be much more time efficient and that people could achieve many of the same benefits, or maybe more so, with the mindful hypnotherapy. The book, Mindful Hypnotherapy, um, the basics for clinical practice, it's basically a treatment manual. And so it is the treatment manual that we used in our initial studies. Um, if, and so that sort of led to a number of randomized clinical trials on mindful hypnotherapy because it's so, it's accessible. And in this article, there've been enough studies that we were able to do a meta-analysis. And based on the meta-analysis, the effect size compared to most mindfulness interventions was larger than most mindfulness-based interventions. So, there's reason to believe that like this is a good idea for um, doctoral dissertations because the manual's right there and there's a good body of research, but it hasn't been applied to enough different problems and different situations. And so it has a lot of potential. But mostly, if you're searching a manual, either as you do the literature review, usually a manual is uh, provided or the access to it. Or if you're not sure, contact one of the leaders in the field. And I know, like for myself, um, whenever I come across a hypnosis intervention treatment manual, I save it on my computer because I go, I might need that later. So, and again, researchers generally are and generally should be, like, get more people to do studies and so share the manual or the control manual or whatever it might be. Other questions or comment before I talk about trial? Okay, so having the researchers done this preliminary research, so they've done feasibility studies. They've shown that the intervention, the study is feasible. They've developed a conceptual framework. They've got their treatment manual and their control manual condition. And so then they're ready to go on to a randomized clinical trial. And so usually the first steps are the development of the protocol. And so the protocol, of course, if you're seeking grant funding, then that's what you submit to seek funding. Or if you don't have funding, it's, of course, what you submit to the IRB to get approval for your study. And so the protocol itself, so it should address or formulate a specific question to be answered and what are the hypotheses. It's generally recommended that, like, as a student or as a researcher, you formulate the question, and the question should be the simplest possible to answer the question, and the study itself should be designed as simply as possible to answer the question. I'll give an example. I'm working on a grant right now, and so I contacted NIH program officer, and so we had the conversation about the study. It hasn't been submitted yet, and so uh, this is an intervention to improve well-being in heart failure patients, and so the study, it had four specific aims, and the program officer goes, "It's too many." Like you're like on a fishing trip. You got too many aims. And so I go, well, how many should we have? And she goes, two. You should have two aims. Um, and so, like, she's really following this idea that, don't make the study more complex than it needs to be. Just really straightforward and simple to answer the question. The study population has to be well defined. Like, what is the population? And, in your feasibility studies, you've already shown that you can accrue in that population. Sample size. So you have to do a power analysis. And so uh, to determine sample size, again, it's an error that I see some people sometimes do. Like, they go in and they go, okay, I'm going to calculate power. So I think I'm going to have 80% power. So how many people do I need for that? So you're not supposed to do it that way. You're supposed to review the literature and identify what would be a clinically significant change. And then whatever that is in comparison to the control group gives you an idea about numbers to enter so that you could do power analysis and have the appropriate sample size. So you've identified sample size. What's the question? What are the primary and secondary outcomes? If it's a clinical trial, it's very, very important, extremely important. Uh, Pre-register the clinical trial. So you have to go to clinicaltrials.gov and pre-register the study. Um, it's important because it holds the study to a higher standard of integrity so that you've outlined what you're going to do and what data you're going to analyze before you start the study. But also, there are a lot of journals, the higher ranked journals, higher impact factor. Many times they will not accept a randomized clinical trial that has not been pre-registered. And
Question on that, Gary.
yeah,
Doctoral dissertations are vetted by a committee that approves a proposal which is on record. Would you still recommend that if it's an empirical study in hypnosis that it be pre-registered somewhere in addition to the proposal being an approved proposal?
yes, it's still very important because the student once their dissertation is approved, so that means that their university has given them the positive go-ahead. The way I think of it is like, oh, you have this covenant established between you and your committee or your university, and if you do what you say you're going to do, you get your doctoral degree. But you still need to pre-register if it's a clinical trial you should still pre-register. Um, and it's one of the things that, we were talking about this a little bit this morning, what is a clinical trial? And so like NIH, they have very clear criteria for determining, is it a clinical trial? And usually if it involves human subjects and they're being randomized and they're getting some kind of intervention, it's a clinical trial. And so, yes, pre-register.
Thank you.
To follow up on that, I'm assuming then that this would be after the IRB had already approved it, and then it would go to the pre-register. Otherwise, the IRB might change it, and we'd have to go back over and over again. So sequentially, we'd go to the IRB first, then to that, and then to the proposal. Or else.
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right. And because it's just that like the pre-registration, it should be before you accrue the first participant, like any time in there.
Or data collection.
And the pre-registration, I mean, it's not like a dissertation proposal. It's not going to the IRB. You're just filling out the form and it can take like a day and you're pre-registered. So it's not as burdensome as you might think. Um, it is, sometimes like, okay, a doctoral dissertation. So you're going along, you got your study pre-registered, and you're starting your study and you realize, oh my gosh, this isn't going to work like this, or I got to accrue differently, or there's some issue. And so you change something midstream. That's fine. Like you just go back to clinicaltrials.gov and you update it to show that you changed something. And it's understood. I mean, like research is not like it's messy. So the unanticipated happens. And it's fine, but you just like it makes it transparent that you tell everybody what you're doing and what you did, and they can follow that. part of it is, I mean, it's a controversy that, you know, when studies are published, to be certain that the researcher isn't going in, doing the study, having a lot of measures, and the ones that were significant, they report those, and the ones that weren't, let's pretend those didn't ever get administered. And so it keeps everything like transparent. Everybody can see exactly what happened.
Well, isn't it maybe to also stop fishing expeditions? So you're going to say ahead of time what you're
Yes.
looking for and not just you're going to try 20 things and the one that comes out is that's what we're going to publish about. So, mm,
That's exactly right.
mm.
Um, and the other thing I think that there is more receptivity to, and I would say really, for sure in the International Journal, negative results are just as informative as positive ones. And so, like if something doesn't work, well, that's just as important to know than, like everything can't work out great. If the experiment, fails to support the hypothesis, well, it's still just as publishable as if it did.
Well, it's something we always point out with our dissertations too. A dissertation does not have to find positive results for you to graduate. So you just have to be able to do the study, right?
I
Yeah,
was going to I was going to make one other comment on the pre-registration. One of the bases for that strong recommendation these days is what's called the crisis of replication, that so many published studies cannot be replicated by other groups who think they're following the same design as the published article. And some of it comes from poor write-ups where some aspects of the design are not written up and described well, but some of it comes from this fudging. People are fudging the data after the fact, and the next group that comes along doesn't get the same results.
yeah, that's exactly right. I'm sure I uh, was on a grant review panel, and I know it was one of the things that came up during the panel is like whatever the study was, it was some intervention, a mind-body intervention, psychological intervention in comparison to usual care. And the comment was like, does it really make any difference whether this study is conducted? Like we already know the result that the researcher has an intervention they believe in, and it'll be better than usual care. And I think that replication bias or need for replication, the crisis of replication, and you know, conducting the studies with minimizing bias as much as is possible really, advances our field and really brings so much more credibility to the work that we do. Being courageous enough that if the results don't come out, then that's fine. Report them. If they do, great. But really striving for objectivity. Okay, so at that point, so the researcher or the doctoral student, they proposed, they have their uh, intervention manual, control group, and IRB approval, and it's pre-registered in clinical trials and so on. They're ready to start the study. So some of the things that I would say that are important in conducting randomized clinical trials is giving consideration that someone needs to be appointed to achieve accrual, so screen participants, um, and then conduct the informed consent process. The randomization needs to be someone who is not involved in the intervention so that the interventionist does not have access to the randomization process. Um, it's generally the case that the interventionist should not be the one collecting data. So there should be a data coordinator. So having someone who is blinded as to the randomization. For example, in my lab, one of the studies that we did, it was an in-person study. And so the individual, like they come into the lab, do informed consent, then they meet with the interventionist, then they would have the intervention, and then the data coordinator comes into the room. And so the data coordinator literally had like a tag on their clothing that said, "I'm the data coordinator. Do not tell me which group you were in." Uh, and so, like they should stay blinded as much as possible, and they just collect the data, and then it's entered. Usually, especially if it's a large study, double entry of data. So it is very easy to make errors in data entry. And so, entering it twice and then comparing the two spreadsheets is generally recommended. Um, there should be, if the interventionist, it's important that the interventionist be well trained. Like, can they really deliver the intervention as intended? And then there there should be some type of monitoring of protocol adherence. So, like, what I mean is, did the interventionist actually follow that study manual or treatment manual that was designed? Um, an example from my own research is this was a multi-site study. And so I was traveling to the Mayo Clinic, and we had this interventionist. They were doing a great job, and then they left. And so the staff there, they had to hire a new interventionist. Um, this was an individual that had completed training in clinical hypnosis and was, I'd say, an advanced doctoral student in clinical psychology. Um, but the individual was trained in Ericksonian hypnotherapy, and they just couldn't get themselves to follow a treatment manual and protocol. Like, they wanted to, but they get in the room with the individual and they would start talking about their concerns. And as a therapist, this individual would just go off in whatever direction felt right to them at that moment. And they just really had a hard time, you know, intentionally staying with the intervention protocol. And that can be in regard to the control group, or it can be in regard to the intervention group. Like an example in my research lab. So I have a lot of doctoral students in clinical psychology. And so somebody is assigned to be the interventionist to deliver the hypnotherapy intervention. Well, somebody gets assigned to deliver the control intervention. And, as clinicians, like, we're all compassionate and we want to help people. And sometimes it can be really hard when you have this person in front of you and they're obviously suffering. You know that you can do something that would be of benefit to them, but you have to deliver the control intervention. And so, really monitoring, like, are both arms really being delivered the way they're supposed to, as intended? Is there adherence? And so, the best way to do that is through um, video recording. and where the person does not know if they're being recorded, but where some sessions are being recorded and the investigator has an opportunity to review those. I've used checklists like adherence checklists, but if the person is using the checklist to prove their own personal adherence, they might just check off all the boxes and go, I know I did good. And they might not actually, it's not the best way to prove that adherence was actually achieved. Okay, so then at that point, um, you've had this adherence. So there's just one other thing I want to talk about before I would say, okay, you've collected the data and you're ready to go on to statistical analysis, and that is adverse event monitoring. So in conducting randomized clinical trials, it is important to have some type of adverse event recording log. The adverse event recording log is where at each contact point that the individual has with the participant in the study is they inquire as to any adverse events. And if there is any adverse event, whether it is related or unrelated to the intervention, and when and how it was resolved. So, like if you haven't done a lot of randomized clinical trials, you might think, well, what is an adverse event? So, an adverse event is anything that happens that causes some distress. So, an example would be if the person was on their way to your lab for their hypnotherapy session and they stubbed their toe on the steps on the way in. That would be an adverse event. And so that should be noted and recorded. So it would be a mild adverse event that is unrelated, and then hopefully it resolved before the person left or resolved a day later or whatever it is. If it's something that is related to the intervention, and I mean, it could be related to the measures. So, if you're doing EEG, was the, glue that was being used, was it irritating to the person? Did the hypnotherapy intervention, like if it involved some type of mental imagery or regression or something that was distressing to the person, then same thing. So that would be an adverse event that would be related. And so these need to be recorded. It really is emphasized in randomized clinical trials and hasn't been in the past. For example, there was a systematic review done of all hypnotherapy studies for treatment of sleep or sleep disturbances. Out of all the studies that have been done, only one tracked any adverse events or reported on them. And so that's not good for our field. Like if there's none, it's fine, but there should be some documentation that there was some, uh, like among ourselves, we probably think hypnosis, well, there's no adverse events with hypnosis, but when we publish our papers and we're reaching the wider audience and the public, that's an important question that only clinical trials can truly answer.
Years ago, I remember an article that was talking about common adverse effects for hypnosis, and a mild headache was the most common one. And by comparison, they used a 1 hour college lecture compared to it, and more students got a headache from a 1 hour college lecture than they did from the hypnosis intervention.
Yeah.
Which says you should be hypnotized and skip your classes. But that was a nice comparison of looking at how common this is in general. If you're sitting there for an hour, and it probably depends on the professor.
That's right.
I mean, that's an example of, a common, a lot of people when they hear hypnosis will talk about having a little headache afterwards, and it usually resolves within, 15 minutes and stuff. But, that's the kind of thing that even 30 years ago sometimes was reported. Mm.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's part of the reason that like in designing a study, defining what you're doing exactly, so like for me in my lab, not in the journal, but in my lab, I make a sharp distinction between hypnosis and hypnotherapy, meaning hypnosis is a state of consciousness, of focused attention, reduced peripheral awareness, and increased responsivity to suggestion. But hypnotherapy, adverse events, like is it teaching college students relaxation, or is it resolving trauma and individuals who've been sexually abused? And so, like, what is the hypnotherapy and what's the population that's being treated? Like, I think as we advance in this wonderful adventure of randomized clinical trials of hypnosis-based interventions or hypnotherapy, I think it's putting more pressure like, oh, we got to be specific about exactly what are we doing and if it's replicated or is this a population, that, oh, this is a risky population. I saw recently there was a study addressing this kind of deal, adverse events with meditation. And, sure enough, they did find that, people who go to these meditation retreats, like it's not all like, oh, wonderful, that some people have negative experience in these retreats. And so, I don't know. I mean, I think as we look further, I mean, it may be that we find some types of hypnotherapy, hypnotic suggestions are more risky than others. I will say in support of Dr. Wilmarth, in this study that I published in JAMA, we tracked adverse events and we didn't find any that were related to the hypnotherapy intervention. It was self-administered hypnosis for sleep and hot flashes, and we reported on adverse events, but there was nothing that was like related to the intervention. It's usually a good idea to have a study monitor. So somebody who's not involved in the study to come in and monitor progress and are there any issues going on, anything that's not adhering to the protocol and so on. So you have that objective outside person.
Gary, would all those roles end up being listed as co-authors for an article when they're published?
It depends. Usually like the co-authors, the person has to make a substantive contribution to the study. And like the reason why I'm hedging is, for example, at Baylor, we have our doctoral program. So usually the doctoral students, like they are making substantive contributions. But over the course of a study, that might go on 3 to 5 years, we might have 100 undergraduates come in and play some role at various times in the study. And so, not necessarily everybody, but those that, like the interventionist, yes, and the statistician who
But
did.
the monitor could be an undergrad student that's coming in and playing a specific role that wouldn't necessarily be a co-author.
That's right. That's right. Are they doing enough, or are they just gaining experience and making some contribution, but it's not really a substantive contribution. You can also, in the article, if somebody maybe they were involved, but they were pretty involved, but they didn't really make a major contribution, then you can recognize them, and you can acknowledge individuals who assisted in some way in conduct of the study.
Increasingly, I see the publications of research reports will give a description of what each author contributed to the process
Yeah,
as
That's
a footnote at the beginning. So you're getting away from everybody who ever breezed through the lab gets named.
Yeah, and that's right. And it's also, in academia, publish or perish. And I know it's been a controversy. I don't know who might be guilty, but it's this thing where I'll put you on my paper if you put me on yours. And I'm not supposed to do that.
but we have a group of Sabrick students that help with the review of the international literature, everything for the Ash Journal, and I know it's particularly in the foreign submissions that they tend to have, 10 authors listed on that, then I see that less often in the US versions, but I think internationally there's still everybody gets their name in.
That's right. That is true. That is true. Um, well, we didn't talk about clinical case studies, but I just want to also emphasize that, the International Journal is interested in a wide range of different types of articles, and even single case studies can be a great value and a great interest. But just like as we've been talking about clinical trials, uh, case studies, they should also be conducted with rigor, and so they should be planned out and measure hypnotizability and have objective and self-report measures of outcomes and be able to present the case study such that it could also be replicated or inform another trial or another study. I was thinking about the acupuncture and another I would say like a very interesting areas, not just like replication, which that's a great idea for graduate students to replicate studies that have come before. But, hypnotherapy interventions, they really do lend themselves to be an intervention in combination with. And so, like if you think about a hypnosis intervention in combination with acupuncture, I'd love to see more studies like that where there's that synergistic kind of approach.
We had a wonderful combination several years ago with the American College of Oriental Medicine and Acupuncture, which was in San Francisco at the same time that Saybrook was. But what we were planning to do, they were doing a lot of auricular acupuncture, which means they were doing the earlobes. And they were doing this particularly in their low income neighborhood clinic because they were treating a lot of drug users and they didn't have a very high budget. So they were treating them in a group setting. So they would have up to 20 people in a room sitting with needles in their ears, waiting for some effect. And they weren't doing anything else, maybe looking at their phone. And what we were going to do was do some meditation training, imagery training, some kind of mind-body intervention with the group while they were doing their acupuncture, and then do a comparison of patients who got the both treatments to patients who only got the auricular acupuncture.
Yeah, that sounds very interesting. Along with that, I would just add, like if there's a study that's like the one that Dr. Moss just described. So, you know, even to measure hypnotizability in these studies, because I think it's like an understudied area. We like mindfulness, acupuncture, even when it's effective, it's not, equally effective for everybody. Um, and those individual differences, to me, it would be very, very interesting and so easy to do is if a study is up and going to measure hypnotizability, you certainly get another publication out of the paper. But
Would you like to mention anything about the Elkins hypnotizability scale?
that's the one I would use. Use the best one.
Well, the biggest advantage of that one is that you can do that within a clinical hour as opposed to the Harvard or the Stanford, which takes more than an hour to administer. And so for most clinicians, it's really difficult. So
Yeah, during the COVID, uh, part of the pandemic, so part of the study that I mentioned was conducted, and so we were doing the EHS, and so we had to transition everything to Zoom, and so we found that we could administer the clinical form of the EHS by Zoom, and it pretty much worked just as well. And so the clinical form, like it takes like 20 minutes or something, 15 minutes. And if you're seeing people on Zoom or remotely, it can be administered. And I will put in a one plug for the EHS. If you haven't seen it in the International Journal, um, a study by Zoltan Kekic and team evaluated the EHS and the uh, Stanford Hypnotic Susceptibility Form C, um, which is, I'd say in the past has been considered the gold standard, but the EHS was shown to be more reliable and yielded a normal distribution better than the Stanford Form C did. So it works good.
and it's now a part of the Saybrook Advanced Hypnosis section for this summer. So maybe we'll have you come back to that class and you can do a live demo for us.
Great. Happy to do it.
Well, we are kind of at our time here. Uh, Thank you very much. I was thrilled when you could said you could come and join us tonight. Um, I didn't say that, I think the second time I ever presented at ASH was with Gary and Stan Bigtol. I think it was probably 35 years ago or something like that. So he was a big part of my welcome into the ASH those years ago, and was helpful ever since. So hopefully we can pass that on to the new students and have them just as involved and have long-term careers in hypnosis.
Well, thank you for having me. And if there's any of your students that are working and they have questions, or if I can assist in some way, will please feel free to reach out to me, and I will do everything I can to support you.
Okay. And hopefully we will be